fisherman's Post. More fish, more often.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fisherman's Post Saltwater Podcast series. This episode is titled Fall Surf Fishing for Big Drum and Sea Mullet. I'm going to be featuring Gary Wall of Coastal Life Outfitters, and he serves the beaches in the Wilmington area. And we're going to be talking about such areas as different surf locations, such as comparing Hatteras to southeastern North Carolina. We're going to be talking about bait and availability of bait. We're going to be talking about rough enough versus tough enough. And when in doubt, go back to the basics. I'm your host, Gary Hurley of Fisherman's Post. Fisherman's Post has been serving the saltwater fishing community of North Carolina since 2003. We've been bringing you fishing reports, fishing tournaments, fishing schools, membership content, and this popular saltwater podcast series where we reach out to our captain and guide friends from up and down North Carolina coast and ask them to share with us their insights, their knowledge on how to catch more fish more often. And in this endeavor, I am joined by my co-host, David Harden of Harden Creative Media. David, welcome to another show.
Gary, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man.
Cool.
I'm excited to have a surf fishing guest on the show. You know, basically, I think you know this, but I'm going to remind you and maybe those listeners, while Fisherman's Post does some boat red drum tournaments over the summer, come fall, we settle in on our fall surf fishing tournaments, and it's about that time, and I am excited. And, you know, we have a surf fishing guest, and surf fishing is in the air.
Well, it's no time like the present. Talk about surf fishing.
It's no time like the present.
You want to talk about some sponsors?
I love sponsors.
Let's talk about Port City Signs and Graphics.
All right. Sabrina and crew at Port City Signs and Graphics. I'm very familiar with them. I used them since Sabrina took over Port City Signs and Graphics.
What I'd like to do is show you two signs. This is a part of the podcast when I show you two signs. You have to pick the one that is Port City Signs and Graphics and let me know if you can recognize them just from sight.
I understand the game.
Okay.
I understand the rules of the game.
I'm going to show you the first sign.
All right.
All right. The first sign says, "Hello, is it meat you're looking for?" And it's got a drawing of Lionel Richie and some sort of ribeye steak. It was from a local butcher.
All right. I'm gonna hold off on my answer until I see the second sign.
Okay. So number 2 is coming at you. Then we have a nice trailer wrap from the Sawmill food truck.
That is a nice trailer wrap. You know, I'm thinking about getting a trailer wrap. So I am familiar with Sabrina and Port City Signs and Graphics work. I recognize that as one of their products. I recognize the restaurant, of course, Sawmill. And I predict before next year's tournament season, the Fish Post trailer is wrapped and looking fancy like that.
Cool. Well, you know, we got another sponsor, Marine Warehouse Center.
We have two more. Two more sponsors.
Let's hold back on that. We're going to do a big
reveal.
Yeah, a big reveal on that. Port City or Marine Warehouse Center. We've got a video.
All right.
Matt with Marine Warehouse, excited to give you guys a huge update. We're now carrying Seabourn and Spider boat line. Of course, we have the newest models of Carolina Skiff, Sailfish, Sea Chaser, and Pan Marine. With over 60 boats in stock at a Wilmington location, let's schedule a sea trial and let's get you on the water today.
All right. We love those guys. I love those guys. Sales, service, and parts, David Harden.
Good people. Good people.
They are. And I have a Marine Warehouse story.
Oh, okay.
They recently had my boat. And they're looking at, again, I can use this as real life example of how they're looking out for me. So just the jack plate. Jack plate need a little bit of service, need a bit of love. And they discovered in working on that the trim tab motor was about to fail, and you don't want it to fail on the water. So proactively, we replaced that failing trim tab motor. And now I am back on the water with confidence thanks to Marine Warehouse Center.
Once again, another success story.
It is, man. I tell everyone, man, not just part of the fish, not just selling to the fishing and boating community, but part of the fishing and boating community. And, you know, other than the challenging way that Terrell tells jokes, man, I find no fault in the whole operation.
That's right. And the joke. Now, are we going to hear one of Terrell's jokes?
I'm obligated to. I mean, the dude. If I don't,
it's in the contract.
He calls me so much as it is. If I were to not do a Terrell joke, I think he would just blow up my phone ridiculous. So here's what he did. Here's what he called, and he gave me this one. He said, again, this is Terrell's joke, not mine.
Gotcha.
What did the buffalo say when he left his child?
When he left his child?
What did the buffalo say when he left his child?
I do not know.
Bison.
Good one.
You laughed.
I did. You gave me you got a little the nasal. You got the nasal snort out of me on that one.
I did. All right. That's a win.
Yeah, it's a good one.
All right.
We have some great news.
Share with me great
We
news.
have a brand new sponsor of the podcast.
We do, and I'm excited too.
YourBoatMoney.com and New Coast.
Yeah, I am more familiar with them than Dave is, so I'm going to take over Scott Bradshaw at YourBoatMoney.com and New Coast Marine Financing. They are on board. They are now sponsoring the podcast, and we love having them here. And I got several reasons why. I'm going to give you one reason why.
Okay.
One reason why is, like, I've had him at the fishing schools before, man. Scott is about information. Of course, he's in the business to sell boat loans, but he understands that if you are an authority and if you help people out with information, then the sales come. So he's a great addition to our fishing schools. And now he's a great addition to the podcast, because that's the theme of the podcast, right? Like, information, empower people with information.
That's it.
So it makes sense. And I have something that Scott wanted to, well, Scott and I brainstormed this. So he wants to give, we want to give a finance tip of the week as part of his sponsorship.
Okay, that sounds cool.
Marine finance tip of the week.
Cool.
You know what this one is?
I do not.
Of course you don't. The more you borrow, the better the rates and the terms are. Did you know that when it came to boat loans?
I did not know that.
The more you borrow, the better the rates and the terms. And the example he gave me was basically, if you finance $50,000 or less, then you're going to get a 15-year loan. If you finance over $50,000, $50,001, you can get a 20-year loan if you wish.
Huh.
Plus the rates go down as the money goes up.
Huh. All right.
So that is it. You're going to hear a lot more about Scott Bradshaw and YourBoatMoney.com and New Coast as we move forward with the podcast. And we're going to have fun facts, or I don't know if we're going to call them fun facts, but I guess for right now.
Well, look, if you know of someone who would like to sponsor the podcast, just give us a call or send us an email at fishermanspost.com.
Hey, humor me before we transition. Show me the MP4 that Scott sent over.
They did send us a cool animation. Let's check it out.
Yeah, man.
Fancy.
Yeah, he's excited about being part of the podcast, man. He's been a fan for years, and he just wants to support and he wants to participate, and we're happy to have him.
Cool.
All right, so now we're moving on. Hey, a reminder that new this year and part of our premium content, like if you want early release access to these podcasts, then we can do so on a membership basis. If you want to tap into our bonus podcast content, not available publicly, man, I'm messing these words up.
You're
left
doing
and right.
good.
I don't know what's going on.
Just keep going.
Then you want to be a premium content member. Information on the fishermanspost.com website, but it's cool. You get weekly fishing reports, you get podcast benefits, you get fishing videos from our fishing schools, a lot of content now for the same low price. Well, now with that being said, as I'm transitioning to introduce Gary Wall, this is when I look at you, David Harden, and say, when this is over, when I've finished my conversation with Gary Wall, I'm coming to you for David's best takeaway.
All right, I'll be ready.
You better be ready.
I'll be ready.
All right. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce to the podcast, first-time podcast guest, Gary Wall, Coastal Life Outfitters, again, serving the beaches in the Wilmington area, to talk about fall surf fishing for big drum and sea mullet. Gary, welcome to the podcast. Pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Happy to have you. Again, surf fishing's in the air, so this is timely. And as excited as I am for a new guest and to talk about surf fishing, no one gets through without the two questions. You tell me you're ready for question number one, I give you question number one.
I'm ready for question number one, Gary.
Question number one, predictably, is why should we listen to anything you have to say about a surf big drum or a surf sea mullet?
Well, I've caught quite a few of both. I grew up on the Outer Banks. I've been surf fishing since I was about 5 years old, and I remember fishing with my uncle, catching sea mullet at my feet with a Zebco 303 reel and a fiberglass rod and transitioning up and being able to fish with some decent gear now. I've always had a passion for surf fishing. I've volunteered and put some time in the Outer Banks and some of the organizations. I'm a member of the North Carolina Beach Buggy Association, and I served on their board of directors and helped with their big drum tournament for several years. When I was on the board and after I was on the board, did a lot of judging. And with that, I had a lot of access to some legendary surf fishermen, folks at the Red Drum Tackle Shop, the folks at Frank's and Frank Fold. All old, good, very, very old and very good friends. And whatever I know is a sum of what they've taught me over the years from the time that I was able to cast until now. So, and I want to pass that information on to other people. That's why I started Coastal Life Outfitters, to pass that information on and prepare another generation of surf fishermen. So let's keep the sport going.
Hey, tell everyone real quick what Coastal Life Outfitters is.
Coastal Life Outfitters, I set this up more as school as much of a guide service, but it's a little bit of both. I think it's important when you teach people how to surf fish that you do it on the beach. You do hands-on. You teach people how to cast while they're fishing. Teach them how to rig their lines, how to cut the bait, what bait to use. Reading the beach, riding down the beach or pulling a cart down the beach. It's a lot easier when you're driving a truck. To be able to see the subtle nuances in the topology of the beach and the where there might be a hole or a rip, or where you might have to cast out a distance to be able to get to where the fish are. So I really want to take the opportunity to teach as much as I do guide. And during the summer, we've had quite a few good sessions this year with some young people that are very excited about surf fishing. I'm very optimistic for the future.
That is a great. Those were great answers for both of them, David. I'm going to move on. I'm going to pass them through to question number 2.
All right, cool.
All right, question number 2 is, if we're going to talk about sea mullet, I want to know what you know about other mullets, as in haircut mullets. So I'm going to give you choices. You're going to tell me who did the mullet better. So I'm going to give you 3 I'm going to give you 3 pairs. First pair, who did the mullet better? Billy Ray Cyrus or Andre Agassi?
I'm gonna have to go with Billy Ray, but I don't know if you can see this, but I might. There we go. I might get Billy Ray a run for his money back.
See, I was intuitive, man. I knew you had mullet in you. All right, pairing number 2. Who did a mullet better? Patrick Swayze or Hulk Hogan?
Hulk Hogan, absolutely Hulk Hogan.
Last one. Who did a mullet better? David Bowie or Michael Bolton?
I'm going to have to go with Bowie on that one.
I think I agree with all 3 of your answers. All right, enough of tomfoolery. Let's get down. The first point, different surf locations. So again, I think you're going to set the stage on Hatteras versus Southeastern North Carolina, I think, but I should just step out of the way and let you tell us what you're going to tell us.
Okay. As I said before, I grew up in the Hatteras and the Nags Head area. I'm very familiar with that brand of fishing. I moved down here about 6 years ago and realized there was a big difference in the beaches. So in Hatteras, we had a lot of sloughs or troughs. And sometimes you'd have a trough. As soon as you step off of the sand into the water, there's usually a little dip and then a little bar. And then there's another deeper dip. And then sometimes there's a sandbar, and maybe even another trough or 2. And so fishing along those edges of those troughs and those troughs where there was a cut in the bar going out into the deeper water, that's where the structure was in Hatteras. And that's basically how a lot of the fishermen work, fish up in Hatteras. And I think that holds true for Cape Lookout and some of the other places, that those are very similar. Down here in the Wilmington area, a lot of our beaches are flat. And what I've discovered is that where the white water is generally where the structure is. That's where the fish are. Now, there are some troughs, there are some cuts in the bar. I always look for a rip, either in Hatteras or down here, because a rip is a great place to catch any fish. That moving water, they'll congregate on the outgoing tide, on the back side of that rip, on the outside where the break in the bar is, and on the incoming tide, they'll be around the mouth of that, and on the inside waiting to ambush those fish. So really, a rip is a holy grail. It's kind of universal between here and there. But The currents on the beach up there are a lot different than they are here. And it just causes us to have a much flatter beach. So it's a little harder to find a good spot to fish here than it is up there sometimes.
Okay, so sloughs and troughs up there, Hatteras Way, are more prevalent both in numbers and in sort of contrast. In southeastern North Carolina, not as many and not as sharp as a contrast, not as deep or as significant. Is that what I follow?
Yes, and the troughs up there can be hundreds of yards long. Down here, if they do have them, they have a tendency to be much smaller or shorter. And you also have to be able to have a good eye on the water down here, because there might be a trough, but it's very subtle. You got to know how to look at the water and the waves and watch those breakers roll off and kind of flatten out into a swell. And that's where you'll find the deeper water here or anywhere else for that matter.
Is that our synopsis of the difference between the two locations, or is that, a start of the conversation?
I think that's the start of the conversation. The other thing that I've noticed is down here, on Hatteras, you see these guys, they really do need the heavers there, especially the guys out of Cape Point. So where that Labrador current comes down and interfaces with the Gulf Stream coming up from the south, it creates that shoal that built Cape Point out on Diamond Shoal. The water gets really rough. You've got to have a rod up there that's capable of handling at least 8 ounces plus bait. So when you're looking at 8-ounce sinker and a big chunk of mullet that might weigh 2.5 ounces, you've got to have a pretty stout rod. So you've got to be well equipped. Down here, I have found that we don't need as big of equipment most of the time. Sometimes you do. If it's coming a big blow, if the water's really ripping and the water's getting big and you've got some wind coming out of the northeast or whatever, you do have to have a stout rod. But I have found that while you need an 8 and bait or bigger rod in Hatteras to really go after the big drum in the fall, down here you can go to a 2 to 5 rated rod or a 3 to 6. I rarely cast anything down here over 6 ounces at this point in time. It's just different. So if I had to have 2 rods up there, I'd probably have a 10-foot rod that was weighted a 10 or to 11-foot rod that was weighted 2 to 5 ounces, and another one that would be rated much heavier. Like I said, an 8 and bait rod. Down here, I fish a 1 to 4 for my mullet and the panfish, and I fish a 3 to 6 for the big drum. And the only time I throw anything bigger than that is if I think there might be a shark in the water and one of my guests would like to catch one, then I will break out the heavy stuff for a shark. But that's about the only time. So a little difference in approach. So and equipment, and of course, along with those rods, make sure you've got a reel that's well matched for the fish that you're targeting.
Hey, you've definitely spawned some questions in me. So first question before I forget, if someone's going to fish Hatteras Way, and again, I just imagine some people watching this podcast, are on the beginner level or, moving into intermediate or new to intermediate. So they might not want to do the full commitment and do Cape Point, where it is and it can be intense, it can be crowded. So if they're fishing the rest of Hatteras Island, do they still need to be geared up for 8 and bait or 8+ and bait?
There's a lot of days that the water isn't that big in other places. Up on the Avon Beach, heading up toward Waves and Salvo, Rodanthe, even up in toward Corolla and the Nags Head area. You can I'd say fish with what you have. If the water's too big, then there's lots of other activities you can do on the Outer Banks to have a good time, and pick your times if you can. You're absolutely right. Beginners would really have a difficult time at Cape Point. There's so many nuances of the things that you expect to do at Cape Point. At first, it's very crowded. There are a lot of experienced fishermen that have little patience for those who are still learning. Tempers can flare, and they're really picky about how they go about doing things. There's a process. There's a whole etiquette of fishing the point. And I would recommend any beginner cut their teeth somewhere else before venturing out there, and then partner with somebody and go and observe and watch before you decide to take it on. It can be an exciting place. The drum action there is phenomenal when the south winds blow for a few days throughout the year. And it can be, but it is very intimidating to show up as a newcomer and try to fit in with the crowd there. It would be very difficult.
Well, thank you. So my next question is more just a comparison of the two areas, as I was sort of reflecting as you were talking. So inshore fishing up there, there's hardly any kind of tide inside. There's very little tide, on the backside of the island, whereas down southeastern North Carolina, we can have, pretty drastic tide. Is that reflected on the surf as well? And then I'm also just wondering about current running down the beach. How do the two areas compare with not just the tide coming in and out, but the current running down the beach?
The tides there can vary greatly on the beach, much like they do here on the beach. I mean, we're experiencing king tides this week. I was down at Fort Fisher yesterday, and the high tide mark was very, very, you had plenty of beach to drive on, don't get me wrong. The narrow spot that you get past that first crossover, I wouldn't have ventured down there at high tide. But you get a lot of wash on that beach. And right now, I think a lot of us, I know a lot of people have seen the recent videos of the houses falling into the water at Rodanthe during the extreme high tide. So they do come in. So you got to be cognizant of the tide. You got to be careful, especially if you're getting an east wind and it blows it on shore. And the east wind is, is kind of a good thing, especially for us. You really do want the wind in your face. The currents down those troughs, though, that is a very good point, Gary. They can run, and they will run and until they find a pressure point to relieve that pressure. That energy has to go somewhere, and that's what creates those rip currents and the cuts in the bar. And like I said, that might not be good for swimmers, but it's great for surf fishermen to find those places. Here, it just runs. I'm able to hold a little better here most of the time, unless it's really, really blowing. Yesterday we were using Sputniks, but we're using light ones. 2 ounces we're holding on the small rods, and 3 ounces we're holding on the bigger rods, even with a big chunk of mullet. A lot of times in Hatteras, though, those sloughs really are like a river flowing right down the front of the beach there in front of you, and it'll pull you one way or the other depending on how it's flowing.
Well, let's transition the conversation, to targeting again, fall big drum and fall sea mullet. And then the next talking point you gave me was bait and availability of bait. So you decide whether we start southeastern or Hatteras and whether we start drum or sea mullet, but let's start the bait conversation.
All right. Well, I'll go right to what was the biggest surprise when I moved down here was to go to a tackle shop and not find a cooler full of mullet or menhaden sitting out front. That you pick a few up, put them in a bag, take them in and weigh them. Because in Hatteras, nearly every tackle shop has a cooler full of mullet or menhaden or finger mullet available, and you get a bag of them and you go to the beach and you cut them up. Down here, I discovered you better find make good friends with the seafood market owners and maybe some of the boat fishermen who might be willing to net you some if you're not capable of netting them yourself. I can throw a cast net okay. I'm not the best cast netter in the world, so a lot of times I'm looking to buy it already caught. So I would say if you're in Hatteras and you're coming here, either bring some with you or go to one of the local seafood markets, and they'll likely have some. And if you're going to Hatteras from down here, you can expect to find some fresh mullet just about anywhere you go. Now, the other bait, we have an abundance of shrimp here. You get that in the seafood market too, and you can cut it up and be prepared. I like to use fresh. I also salt my shrimp, and I also brine my mullet if I have some left over, and then freeze them in vacuum pack so I can use them later. And the formula that I use to do that has sea salt, soda, and baking soda so it doesn't get leathery, and ice. I let it soak for about 2 hours and then dry them off vacuum pack. And they'll stay good for 6 months. But the mullet that I have in my freezer right now was from earlier this year is just as usable as it was the day I stuck it in the bag. So I'm not afraid to use that. But that was one of the big differences I found, was the availability of that. Now, the other thing I'll say about bait is, if you're throwing your own cast net in the fall, the mullet are going to be running in surf. There's a big difference between throwing a cast net off the deck of a boat in some still calm water than it is walking out in the breakers and throwing a cast net. I know some people that can do it and have been very successful. I haven't developed that skill yet. That's not, that's not my superpower, but that was different. Now, one of the other things that I have found is the availability of sand fleas. Sometimes you do have to look for those. They can be a great bait for both sea mullet and the great big giant sand fleas. Some of them that'll get 1.5 inches, 2 inches long. You put a couple of those on a big circle hook and put it out there close to the shore, and that first little drop off after you get in the water, and you'd be surprised the size of a drum that would come in and hit a big old sand flea like that. So don't be afraid to do that too. But that's the big difference, was not having the bait shops have the fresh mullet here available when you were there buying everything else, and having to make the extra stop at the seafood store to find them there.
All right, I'm going to begin my follow-up with southeastern beaches. So if we're talking fall big red drum and we're talking sea mullet, we've established fresh mullet and sand fleas. What would be your second, or maybe shrimp is your primary and sand fleas is your second? I guess what I'm basically getting at is, I understand mullet for big red drum. Do you have a secondary in mind? And then for sea mullet, is it 1, 2 shrimp, sand fleas, or sand fleas, shrimp? Like, what order would you put that?
I would have a shrimp on one hook and a sand flea on the other, and I also back them with fish bites. I put fish bites on first. So if the bait stealers come through and steal your shrimp or bite off your sand flea, you still have something there. I've caught some impressive sea mullet with sand flea and shrimp flavored fish bites. It's a very good product. Fish gum is another one that works real well. While mullet and menhaden are my go-to for mullet, most of the time, it's tough to beat a spot in the fall and a spot head. Some people have trouble fishing with the fish heads because sometimes their mouth will gape open in water. What I normally do is sometimes even a menhaden head, and I'll take and very carefully with my knife. I have a big scalloped edge knife, and I'll cut that bottom lip off to make it more aerodynamic, so it'll ride in the current a little bit better. The same way with the back end of the fish, cut the tail off and have a section of about 1.5 inches, 2 inches long, and hook it in that narrow portion of the tail with the meaty piece sticking out the back, and it'll set in the current a little bit better and not create a lot of drag on your line. And also, smaller sea mullet are great baits, especially in spring for big drum, but they'll hit them in the fall too. So if you don't have the availability of mullet and the spot are running, get you some bloodworms and some shrimp and some fish bites, and catch you a cooler full of spot, and you're set.
Sand fleas just as prevalent in Hatteras as they are southeastern?
Yes. Oh, yes. In some places, depending where you are. I mean, you can walk down the beach in a lot of places and not even see them. They're hard to find sometimes, but when you find them, you normally find a lot. But yeah, they're just as prevalent and just as effective in both places.
All right. Before we go to tough enough or rough enough versus tough enough, since we're sitting here talking about bait, let's talk for a minute about rigs. Let's talk for a minute about terminal tackle and, red drum me and then sea mullet me.
All right. Red drum, I typically like to use a fish finder rig. Basically I've got a shock leader on my mono main line. My main line is going to be probably a 15 to 17 pound test mono. I use mono because I just like it better. It's easier to cast for me. I know you can get a lot more out of braid, but if you're fishing fast and furious, braid can cause you some problems sometimes. And if you're fishing with other people, you don't want to snap their line. So anyway, on my shock leader that I have, so that I don't snap a big sinker off, I normally tie on a shock leader of 40 to 50 pounds. On that line, I'll sinker slide, and I'll put a bead on either side of that to protect the knot for the rest of your terminal tackle and to protect your eye coming back in, so you don't, especially if you're fishing at night, you lose track of where your line is. You don't suck your terminal tackle up and tear up the tip of your rod. And then of course, for the big drum, I normally fish with 7/0 circle hook, 6, 7, 8/0 circle hook, depending on what I got. And I use that fish finder rig a lot. Down here sometimes though, when I'm looking for where a hole might be, I'll even use a knocker rig, or I'll just put a round sinker on the sinker slide on the fish finder and let the current bounce it around a little bit until I find it. Now, I was talking a couple of weeks ago with a local friend of mine, Tommy Farmer, and he was talking about casting into those rips. And sometimes you can cast into that rip and catch that current and have a round sinker, and it'll take your line out a lot further than what you can cast. And I had never really thought about that. So I had kind of been doing it by accident, but it does make a lot of sense. So fish finder rigs, there are places for fixed terminal tackle. I normally try to keep my hook leader between my swivel and my hook, probably about no more than 4 inches long. I've started snelling my hooks instead of crimping, because my crimping abilities were not as good as my knot tying skills. And I also use a Palomar knot mostly on my terminal tackle on the swivels to hold those on. It's just a little less machinery out there to grab some grass. So if it's really windy, sometimes I'll use a fixed rig that's on a 3-way swivel and tie a sinker in one of those, but I still keep my rigs rather short. But for the most part, I use a fish finder rig. For mullets, I tie my own rigs for mullets, and I use some of the colored beads and some of the colored floats. And sometimes I'll use a double dropper with those, and sometimes I'll use a single dropper if it's really, I call them my one-arm bandits. It kind of helps not to have extra stuff floating. So if the water's really ripping, I'll only fish with one hook for them. And matter of fact, I was using that when I won your fall fishing tournament at Pleasure Island a few years ago for the sea mullet category. I was using one of my rigs for that. So they come in handy. You'll catch a variety of fish with that: black drum, spot, croakers, sea mullet. Yesterday I had a young man with fish finder rig catch a very nice ladyfish. He was a 23-incher. It was his personal best. He was very excited. But they're double dropper rigs. And if you don't know how to tie them, you can buy them at a store. And believe me, I've caught a lot of them on the metal double dropper rigs that you see for 50 or 75 cents a piece. Put your sinker on the bottom, tie you some hooks on. There's one thing for sure: if you don't have a line in the water, you're probably not going to catch a fish. So get a line in the water some way and work it and see what works. Sometimes flashers on the hooks will attract them. One year they wouldn't bite, sea mullet wouldn't bite, and the puppy drum wouldn't bite the silver flashers, but they would the orange flashers. And a buddy of mine and me went and bought every orange flasher hook that Frisco Tackle had at Frisco Gun and Tackle and came back, and they were still biting only those orange flashers. So sometimes you have to play around and make some changes and see what they want.
All right. When you're talking about red drum, and it said it's sometimes a positive to have it sort of sliding around, moving around. What about for sea mullet, man? Do you like to hold bottom? Is it better for feeling the bite, or just working an area to be more static with sea mullet, but red drum, it can move around and find the fish?
Once you find the fish, then I would go fixed and try to cast into that general spot again. There are a lot of people that subscribe to the methodology of all you need to do is grab a bucket and a fishing rod and walk across the dune and cast into the water. That's a plan, and it might work for you sometimes, but on average, it's probably not going to. So I generally will move around, even with a frog tongue or a pyramid sinker. I'll cast out if I'm only fishing with a couple of rods. And I'll cast out and I'll pull it in a little bit, and I'll pull it in a little bit, and I'll start looking for them that way. And sometimes I will do, but then once I zero in on them, the sea mullet are schooling fish. If you find one, there are a lot of other ones usually not far away. So you try to cast back in there, and that's where casting accuracy and ability comes into play with surf casting. It's not as precise as the bass fisherman trying to flip a crankbait up underneath a dock or a spinner up underneath a dock. But you need to be able to get back in those general areas. So the ability to cast accurately and to wherever the fish are, whether that be a long way out or only a few yards out. I've caught them from the suds around my feet out to as far as I could cast. And so find them any way you can, play around. And also don't be afraid to move. If you haven't caught fish in 15, 20, 30 minutes, go find another spot perhaps. Gets a little hard when you have a crowd with you and you've got kids playing and tents set up. But if you're out there to fish, you don't be afraid to go and move to another spot. A spot can look promising and not have a fish. Other ones might not look as promising and may have a ton of fish. So you just don't know what's under the water until you go probe it.
All right. As intrigued as I am by rough enough versus tough enough, I'm still not gonna set that one up yet. And you've been touching on this now, but we got bait, we got a rig, and maybe just dial in a little bit more on where the particular conditions you're looking for, the topology you're looking for red drum, and then how you cast and work it. And then the same question for sea mullet.
Well, the first thing I do is I like to ride the beach at low tide, dead low tide. That gives you a view of the beach, and you can imagine the water coming in. So you can see where holes are. If you're riding along the beach and you see little mounds of sand or bigger mounds of sand, and then they slope off, typically at high tide, there's going to be a hole in front of you. Look for some places where there's some shells down in the water because they forage in those shells. And so reading the beach involves more than just going fishing. Sometimes it involves just riding up and down the beach or walking up and down the beach and enjoying a nice stroll with your bride or your girlfriend or whoever you're with, and take note of where those places are. I typically mark them on my GPS in my truck when I'm down at Fort Fisher or I'm up at Hatteras, so I can get back to the exact same spot, especially if I'm night fishing. But make notes of landmarks to mark where those holes are. So that's part of it. Later on, when you're fishing, you can start seeing how the water's running, and if you're having water come up to the beach on either side of you and you're on that mound and it's not coming into you, that tide's coming in just as hard toward you on that mound as it is on either side, which is a firm indication that you have deeper water in front of you. So that's always a good sign. The other thing I always look for, like I said, is those rips, that telltale stream of suds that looks like it's going out into the ocean. It is a stream of suds going out into the ocean past the bar. It may not look like it's there, but if you see that stream of suds going out, there's current flowing out of there, and the chances of that area holding fish are very good. Now for sea mullet and drum, they both like the water a little bit churned up. People refer to it looking drummy. Looking drummy is choppy water. Sometimes it's a little bit muddy, but it's not slick calm. It doesn't look like Bahama going to the beach water and turquoise green. It's a little, it can be a little bit ugly, and they like it when it's that way because it churns up the food that they're eating on the bottom. And typically they eat largely the same thing, except the sea mullet don't eat as much mullet. I have caught them on my drum rigs, though. I've caught some big sea mullet on drum rigs with fishing with mullet and with menhaden. But they typically feed the same way off the bottom that way, and when it's churned up, they like it. And so when you go out there and you look and say, "Wow, it just doesn't look like a good day fishing," well, the fish don't mind a rough water. Especially big drum. I mean, some of the days that we have fished on Cape Point where those currents smack together, it looks like a washing machine out there. Sometimes it'll spray water up 15, 20 feet in the air where those currents are hitting each other. And so the other thing during those spells, you probably need to invest in some foul weather gear and a good pair of waders. because in the fall, the chances of you getting wet otherwise is pretty high.
All right, I'm enjoying this. So I think this might be our segue into rough enough versus tough enough. If they both species like it a little churned up, a little roughed up, is that where we're headed with rough enough versus tough enough?
Absolutely. It sometimes to hold bottom, even with sea mullets, you might need to use a bigger rod than you think you need to. Will do to keep your bait where the fish are. It's the fall season. It is in the middle of hurricane season, so we're subject to have the before or the after storm things to deal with the water being muddy. As I said before, though, part of that rough enough and tough enough is you really want the wind in your face when you're surf fishing, because that blows the bait fish and the other things that they feed in closer to the beach. Drum, like those calico crabs that are going up and down the coast, they like to eat them too. And so, if you can catch those. But anyway, the onshore winds will blow the bait to the beach. And while that's not really good for casting, it's great for the fish being in the shore. The other thing that does though, it blows the water right at you. Your tides are going to be a little bit higher. You got to be cognizant of that, and where your vehicle or where your beach cart is, where your rods are, how well are your sand spikes holding? Do you have big enough sand spikes for the rods that you have? And don't forget to slack your drags when you put your rods in those holders. You don't want to come back and see that trail of sand through the sand going out toward the ocean and a rod holder laying on the beach with no rod in it. That's a bad feeling, I'm sure. But so you put those rods in there, make sure you slack the drags, because you don't want a big fish come along, pull it out. Could be a skate, could be a shark. Hopefully it's a big red drum.
All right, let's go to your last talking point then. And when in doubt, go back to the basics. Like, I believe I know what you're talking about, but of course we want to hear it from you.
Well, there are certain things that are kind of universal truths when it comes to surf fishing. Get good bait. I mean, you need to have good bait, and you need to put it on often. You need to change it. My rule of thumb is every 15 minutes. Sometimes if the water's running really fast, you might need to do it every 10 minutes, because it'll wash the oils and the scent and the flavor away, and you're just sitting there with a piece of bland meat, and fish don't like that. So, good bait, fresh bait, keep it fresh. If you reel in your rod to check for something, just go ahead and put some fresh bait on it. You already got it all the way in. You might as well put some fresh bait on it and send it back out. Rigs, get some quality stuff. If you're not confident in your knot tying skills, all the bait shops have great pre-built drum rigs, bottom rigs. They'll help you. They'll help you fix those things out. But get good quality stuff. You don't want to be out there and all of a sudden your stuff start pulling apart. I mean, that makes for a bad day. As with all beaches, tides have a big effect. I've caught a lot of fish at both tides. Of course, the changing of the tides and the movement of the water has most to do with that. For some reason, I've caught quite a few more sea mullet at low tide than I have big drum, and I've caught more big drum at high tide than I have at low tide. Just personally for me, that could be conversely true for somebody else. Time of day has a big deal to do with it. Night fishing is the best time to fish for the big red drum, and sea mullets seem to feed real well at night too. But those drum they come in shore to spawn, and they appear from everything that I've read and heard that they like to spawn in the evening, and they also like to feed in the evening. Another thing that is true is lights. You want to keep your light to a minimum. I normally, if I have to turn one on, I have a headlamp with a red lens in it. But a steady light doesn't seem to bother them as much as somebody flashing a light. So somebody shining some headlights on the water or a big spotlight on the water, that I try to not fish around those folks if I can help it. And I try not to shine my light in the water when other fish. But if you absolutely have to, you absolutely have to. I mean, if you got a fish on or something, it's understandable. The other thing that to do is find some locals and do what they do. I mean, they do know the water. So if you find some people, most of the people on the beach are nice and willing to share some information. It's not like you're finding your secret pond out in the middle of the country that you're going to go that's full of bass and crappie. It's a big ocean. There are lots of holes. And so most of the time there's room enough for everybody. And most of the time you'll find people are pretty honest. The other thing is I think you really need to develop, and this is true across no matter where you go, is developing your casting skills. Being able to cast to where the fish are is if there are no fish where you're able to cast to, there's no need to cast to start with. So if they're in close, that's fine. Sometimes they're out a little bit further. So learning how to do some distance casting is important, and then learning how to be accurate with your cast to be able to pinpoint those places where you know that are structured. Another thing for night fishing, and this is a tip that I should have mentioned a while ago with the lights. I use a little chem sticks. I like the ones that are about an inch, maybe 1.25 inches long. And what I have found, the best thing to hold them on the tip of my rod with is the blue painter's tape. It comes off easy. It holds all night long. It'll even hold when it's damp. But when you're ready to take it off the next day and not have to deal with that on the end of it, it doesn't leave any residue on your rod. And it's very easy to deal with. It's not like electrical tape leaving gum or duct tape or other tape. It's just very easy to use. So that's a tip that I would use. And then if you are fishing at night, it's also important to organize your tackles so that you know where things are, so that you're not, it's everything's harder in the dark. It's harder in the dark. You've got to get there before dark. You got to also understand your surroundings and know where, okay, when I walk out to this point, I need to be casting slightly to my right, ever how far you think you need to go. And at night, you got to play around with moving your bait around a little bit more too, and to hit those sweet spots. But but I work on the casting skills as something that I work on with a lot of my clients. Quite a few of them have never casted a surf rod before, and they're amazed at the difference between slinging 4 or 5 ounces of bait and sinker than flinging a worm and a bobber or a rubber worm for a bass. It is markedly different. And so that's some things to bear in mind. Wind, like I said, you really want the wind in your face. Just because the boys at Cape Point want the wind out of the south, that doesn't mean we want it out of the south here. Here we kind of like it out of the east, maybe a little bit of southeast, but we kind of like it out of the east into our face. And play around. There's nothing wrong with experimenting. If you talk to a fisherman, you've talked to a fisherman. That what works for him or her may not work for you, and what works for you may not work for them. I learn something every day from somebody. Whether it's online or a fisherman on the beach, I pick up something new just about every day. I've been doing this for almost 50 years, or a little over 50 years now. I forget how old I am. I still think I'm 45, but I'm not. And then, there's always something to learn. So, play around with it too. Don't think everything's hard and fast. The only rules that are involved in fishing are those that are made up by the state and the government. And other than that, you're free to do what you want to do. So have fun. That's the most important thing. And don't take yourself too seriously. If you take yourself too seriously, it cuts down on the fun factor a lot. Laugh at your mistakes. You'll make them. You'll snap off. We all cuss a little bit when we do that. You're going to snap off some baits. It's going to happen. I do it just about every trip at least once. But shake it off. Move on. Just have fun. That's what we're here for.
Man, I very much enjoyed your answer there to go back to the basics. I think it was a good summation. Enjoyed this entire podcast. I'm sitting here thinking to myself, man, I've got so many questions that I want to ask you during our bonus content because we have run out of time. So I am going to have to bring this podcast to a close. Certainly have you back again as a guest. And again, already looking forward to the bonus content feature we're going to do after wrapping this up. But for right now, Gary Wall, Coastal Life Outfitters, man, thank you so much for being a guest tonight and sharing some knowledge on fall surf fishing, big red drum, and sea mullet.
And thank you, Gary, for what you do and what the Fisherman Post does here and in our community. And I appreciate all the tournaments that you do, and I know that the other fishermen in the area do as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with my surf fishing relationship too, man. I'm very, very fond of that community. All right, Gary, thank you, man.
Thank you.
All right, David Harden, I'm going to bring you on now.
All right. Let me consult my notes.
You're welcome to consult your notes.
Okay, so there was a lot. We covered a lot. We covered a lot in there.
We did.
It was a good education. One of the things that stuck out to me though was when we were talking about bait, using the salted shrimp and brine mullet with the combination of the sort of that chewing gum type stuff, the sand fleas, to help stay on there. So
fish bites, fish gum.
Fish bites, that's it. Also spot heads. I've never, other than trying to catch a shark, I wouldn't think be using a spot head to catch anything else, but apparently they're something to use.
They are.
And again, if you're looking for the location, ideally you'd be looking for like a rip in the water, and you see the foam going out. That's sort of like your prime area for casting. So those are some of the things that I took away from it.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good list, David, man. Yeah, Gary was full of information. Like that could have, if I let that guy go, we could have had 2 podcasts out of this. I have no doubt about that.
It'll be a sequel.
Maybe it will be a sequel. But for right now, let's bring this podcast to a close.
All right. Well, we'd like to thank all our sponsors, Port City Signs and Graphics, Marine Warehouse Center, and our new sponsor, yourboatmoney.com, and New Coast. If you'd like to become a sponsor of the podcast, just contact the Fisherman's Post office at fishermanspost.com.
Yeah, man. And once again, we have premium content membership. So if you're interested in our bonus content coverage of this podcast, just go to fishermanspost.com and look for member content. But for now, David, thank you so much for another episode.
You got it.